This episode is brought to you by our friends at BetterMan. BetterMan is helping men everywhere have a biblical vision of manhood, one that's rooted and grounded in God's timeless word. You can check them out at betterman.com. That is betterman.com. Kelly, did you know that my first kiss was sharing the gospel with somebody?
I do know this. I was there.
Dear listener, did you know? Were you there?
Yes.
You were in the vicinity,
I was in
but
the
you
vicinity.
weren't there.
We were.
And you weren't the kiss either.
No, I was
which
not,
is what
but we
makes this
were-
story compelling.
We were dating.
We were dating, but you were not my first kiss.
Awkward.
And I was kissed. His name was Shane. I was.
All these things are true.
At a bar. We went to the bars up at A&M on Northgate, and we were out there sharing the gospel. We did it every Thursday.
We being a group of us, college students, myself included, but not just the two of us. It was a group of people.
That's right.
We'd pray together first.
And then we hit the bars with gospel tracts in our hand and love in our hearts. And we went out to a particular bar, and the crowd was moving out, and a very tall, strong Gaston-like fellow named Shane came out, and I approached him and began chatting with him. Hey, what's going on? It became quickly apparent that Shane was inebriated, and me and my posse around me just sort of leaned in and said, we're just going to ride this train till the bitter end. And it was a bitter end because at some point, as I'm talking to him
about Jesus,
we're in the conversation. Shane kind of puts his hands on my shoulders, and I'm like, am I about to be hurt by this man? In a way I was, I suppose, because he stops me in the middle of my talking, and he says, Jimmy, yeah, I love you, man. I was like, dude, I love you too. That's why I'm out here. He's like, no, I love you. And that man brings me in and plants one on me. And it was a solid kiss, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not proud of it, but it happened. And I try to live a vulnerable, known life. So now, world, you know, my first kiss was a man named Shane, but it did not come willingly.
Wow.
And
that is a terrible thing to say.
And that's how I wanted to start this episode, because today, watch the segue, we're talking about evangelism. Did you see what I did? It was an evangelism story with a little bit of intrigue, and now we're into the theme of evangelism. And maybe the lesson here is evangelism is a tricky thing.
Or maybe evangelism to inebriated people in the bars is maybe not our best play.
I don't know. Whatever the Lord calls it to. But my point is, we are taking this episode to do some thought work on that theme. As I'm speaking, feel the regret coming for my future self when I reflect on the fact that I just told that story.
Yes, yeah. I think you may.
But YOLO, as Gen Z says. Anyways.
Point being, even since the earliest part of our dating, evangelism has been
a big feature,
a big part of our life.
We're burdened by it. Hopefully, if you're a Christian and you're listening to this, you feel a burden by evangelism. We mean the commitment to sharing the good news of Jesus. Evangelism comes from the word good news, right? And so we're taking good news to people. It is what we do as Christians. And we wanted to consider that as we're thinking about the themes of this season. This season is all about God being at the center of all things. And so we're taking as many things as we can grab, and we're going, well, how is God at the center of this? How can God be more at the center of this feature of my life, or this aspect of my theology, or this way to think about relationships, or so, and so on.
Can I ask you a question
as we get
into this? Because I think a question that may be forming in people's minds as they hear us even talking about this is, it's evangelism. It's sharing the gospel. Isn't it by its very nature God-centered? Like, what are even the other, is there a way to do evangelism that is not with God at the center? And what might that other thing be at the center?
Well, I
Is that
think
a fair
that there is
question?
yeah, I do. I think that that's really what I want us to look at is how do we think about evangelism, particularly what motivates us
Mhm.
when you're reaching out to a lost friend or sibling or coworker or whatever. What's in the driver's seat? That's the question tonight. What
Mhm.
motivates us to share the gospel? Why share the gospel? Why share the gospel? And you're right. Maybe some people are like, well, yeah, of course it's God centered, but I have actually found in myself, anyways, that what has often been in the driver's seat, especially in my younger days, was not the full picture of what should be motivating me to reach out to people with the good news of
Mhm.
Jesus. So let's talk maybe for a bit about motivations. When you think about why you're sharing the gospel with people, what comes to mind?
Mhm.
What is the loudest thing there? My
Mhm.
suspicion is, and this is not a bad thing, the leading edge of why we say we want to share the gospel with people is because we have a burden to see people who we love be saved. We
Mhm.
want them rescued from hell. We want them with Jesus in heaven. And what a beautiful thing that
It's
is.
a good thing.
It's a proper
Mhm.
motivation.
Yes.
And it's a motivation we see in the scriptures.
Yes.
Yeah. So when you think of a moment like Romans 9,
Mhm.
Romans 9 is a great example of Paul expressing his burden about his people, the Jews, and how he wants
Mhm.
them to be saved. So he says in Romans 9, verses 2 and 3, he says, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen, according to the flesh. He's saying, man, I sure would, I'd be willing to trade places
Right.
with them if only they could be saved. So clearly in this moment from Paul is showing us that it's an appropriate thing to feel burdened for people that they would be saved.
Right.
Yep. Do other examples come to your mind in the scriptures of that type
Of that
of
showing up.
motivation? Yeah.
Well, it's in the next chapter as well. How will they hear without a preacher? I mean, there's this sense of people need to hear to be saved. How will they hear if someone is not sent
Mhm.
to them? So it is a good motivation. It is the right motivation.
It's God's motivation, at least in part. I remember one of the earliest Bible verses I memorized was Ezekiel
Mm.
33:11. I had it on my dry erase board in my room as a kid. Why did I have a dry erase board in my room?
Because dry erase boards are awesome.
And they're still awesome. They're
Yes.
as relevant today as they were
100%.
20 years ago.
We have a huge one in our house.
That is true. Ezekiel 33:11. So God says, say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Turn back from your evil ways, for why will you die, O house of Israel? He's looking at the people of God, Israel, and he's saying, you're perishing, and it's breaking my heart. I don't take pleasure in the death of the wicked.
Mhm.
So I think these are very normative ways to think about why we share the gospel.
Mhm.
And I'm just asking in this episode, is that the whole story?
Mhm.
Or are there more thoughts that could even enrich our motivations further? And I would say most of the time, most people I interact with, including myself, until a certain moment in my life, only had one half of the motivation. There's a whole
Mhm.
other half.
Right.
And for me, the other half came in college. I was doing a little Bible study prayer time with one of my roommates, and we were praying over and through Psalm 119, and we landed on this verse, Psalm 119, 136, and this verse began for me a pretty seismic shift in like how I was thinking about things like reaching the lost. What should really be breaking my heart when I think about that there even is a group of people in the world who don't treasure God. says this, Psalm 119, 130. So you want to read it? You have it there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It says, my eyes shed streams of water because men do not keep your law. Or my eyes shed streams of tears. I mean, that's what it's talking about. Because men or because people don't keep your law.
We prayed for 2.5 hours over that verse. It was, side note, like a really wonderful prayer time. I thought we prayed for 45 minutes. I looked at my watch. It was like, oh my gosh, we're like, it's very, very long. But I remember God bringing me to tears thinking about that. It was the first time I had the experience of not just sympathy for people, but sympathy for God.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to set before you today in this episode is to help us develop, and it's a theme we've talked about it from a lot of different angles over the seasons here, but what would it mean for your evangelism if your first and primary sympathies weren't just with the lost person in front of you, but were with the God who was being slighted and not enjoyed like he exists to be enjoyed? That blew my mind.
Yeah. Well, it's a very foreign idea. I don't think that's it's not a natural idea. It doesn't come to us naturally. It's very unnatural. It's uncomfortable, I would say, in some ways, to even think about things like evangelism being for the sake of God, as much as it is for the sake of people. Like that's just a new thought for most people. And so that's one thing to say about it. I think another thing to say is that having that full picture, that both sides of the motivation, right, in evangelism being for both God and his glory and people and their good, I have found it to be the only motivation strong enough to push me past the discomfort of the offense of the gospel as you share it, the discomfort of this is going to there's just, oh my gosh, in our culture, right? It's like everything, right? There's so much cost. There's an increasing cost, maybe not to some parts to the degree of some of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. But if your only motivation is what's good for the person on the other side, then it actually makes you slower to share, I feel like, because you're like, well, they don't seem interested, just, I don't know. There's all this stuff that can get in the way. But when it's also for God, this person's offended you, God. And that bothers me because you are my number one. You're my favorite person. You're my best friend. You're my greatest loyalty. And I'm not okay with that. And it gives me motivation to persist in prayer for the people in my life. It's just an entirely new way to pray. It gives me more courage in the moment of sharing and in the moment of conversation.
Yeah.
That just love for the other person feels slow, can feel slower to do those things. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, but I think both motivations have to be there: the glory of God and the good of the person on the other end of that evangelistic conversation.
Yeah, I think the way I'd put it is it creates a resiliency. It has created a resiliency in me to keep moving forward, even when we're meeting obstacles, even when I'm meeting hostility, because there's someone new I'm doing it for.
Yes.
That sweetens the whole thing for me. And one of the I remember maybe sometime after that, I'm still sharing the gospel especially in my early 20s. It was a little bit more like street preaching style. We'd go up to folks and we had gospel tracts and do that sort of thing. And I think culture shifted a little bit it shifted away from that making as much sense a lot of the times, but in some of the spaces I was in back in the day, that made sense. I was doing that, and I remember having just people screaming at my face and taking like the things we were handing out, and like this one chick lights it on fire in front of me, and like watching it burn as I'm trying to like plead with her to know the Lord. And but how do you make it on the other side of that moment, not feeling so like utterly deflated? And I think for me, this has been a major feature to like help sturdy me and give me some like, resilience, some buoyancy on the other side of hostility. This episode is brought to you by our friends at BetterMan. What is the most trusted voice in the life of a man today? It's BetterMan. BetterMan is more than a resource, it's a movement. Everyone agrees that when men are better, the world is better. BetterMan, it gives men the language and the license they need to be all that God has called them to be. When men are at their best, listen, marriages thrive, children are blessed, the church is strengthened, the world changes. So let's change the world. Check them out today at betterman.com. That's betterman.com. I think there was we said this in maybe the first episode of this season, that I mentioned that sermon that changed my life, the 10 shekels in a shirt sermon. If you haven't listened to it, by the way, yet, I would commend it to you. It has really, the older I get, the more I feel like I've been really formed by it. But he tells this story, and hopefully I don't butcher it. It's been a little while since I've listened, but he tells this story of, I think he was going over to do mission work in a developing nation. This is back in the 40s or 50s. Paris Reed had the preacher. And he said he had this revolution and reformation in his heart when he got there. And he said, everything that drove me to go overseas was my burden for what he called it, the heathen, the unchurched, the godless heathen, that if they only knew the gospel, they would hear, and then the light would come on, and then just gladness would flood their heart. And he said, I was so devastated and confused when I got there, and I started talking to them about God, and discovered in many ways they knew the God I was talking about, and they didn't want to have anything to do with him. They were just fine in their sin. And I felt so deflated after that. And he talks about like kind of going back to his little base area and getting alone with the Lord and just going, what is going on? And he felt the Lord bring up in his heart, will not the judge of all the earth do right? That line from Genesis. And he realized, when I have only man's good in mind, in my evangelism, it actually isn't a strong enough motivation to like send me out, to keep me going. I need something bigger than that. I need, and this is what he discovered, I need the glory of God not being enjoyed by people. I need that to be such a horror in my mind that all I want is for this God who is such a delight to be found delightful. Right. And that was like a Copernican revolution in his mind. And for me, it's been a shift for me too, of like, that'll change everything about the way you approach the lost world.
Yeah. That every person who has not trusted Christ in this world, they, in not giving glory to God, are stealing glory from God that is due his name. Yeah. And that should bother us. And we should care about that and pray for that to change. Because what other God is there who dies for his rebel people? Like, who else is as good as he is and continues to sustain us with life and breath and sunshine and rain and all the things, even in our rebellion, and send his son, and people still go, I don't want anything to do with you. It's like, excuse me, what? No, not okay. Not okay with me. Now, you can't force anybody to trust in him, but you can pray. You can shed tears for the sake that people do not honor God, and pray for that to change. I think it just creates a drive and a motivation in our desire to be evangelists for this good news and for the God behind the good news. Yeah. But I also think, especially in Western cultures, this motivation in evangelism is really helpful to our actual expression of evangelism. Meaning, the only reason you share the gospel is I want something good for you. I want your life to be better. What happens when the person on the other end says, my life's just fine? I'm great. And actually, following your God is going to make my life harder. And you're going, yeah, it will.
Yeah.
Now, what do you say? Is it really for their good when essentially what you're saying is it's going to hurt really bad?
Yeah. If if all you want is for them to be better, feel better, and they're saying they do, it's like, well, I guess that's it. But so there has to be something richer behind that. It's like, no, I actually want God to, I want God to get what he rightly deserves from me.
Well, and I think it's even compelling to people. I mean, we have seen it to be compelling to people. We have shared the gospel within our home to look at them and say, have you ever thought about how offensive your sin is to God? Like, have you not just considered that it doesn't even matter if it's harming you or harming others. Have you considered the harm you're doing to the God who made you, who keeps you alive right now? Like, to even just introduce that idea to somebody can awaken them in actually a really good way. We all long for this, to live for something bigger than ourselves. I mean, I think that's an innate desire in the human heart, which we usually chase in 1,000 small ways. But to say that to somebody and to even share the gospel in ways that are even pleading to the person, you owe your life to this God, and you have constantly spurned him at every turn and don't care about him. Like, to compel them in that way, I think can be a really huge gift to some people. And we have seen it be the difference maker for certain people in our life, not everybody, but for certain people to step over the line of faith, where before they had already heard the gospel, they understood the gospel, they didn't want to give up certain sins in their life because it wasn't hurting anybody. It didn't seem that bad. They were fine with it. It's like, why do all this hard work? And it was that idea that was the difference maker to go, I've never thought about that. Essentially it's them going, I've never considered God to be a real personal God who my sin is personally offensive to, who might actually want a personal relationship with me and actually deserves my honor and respect and devotion. That all of those ideas and all of that help in evangelism, those ways to talk about the gospel to people can only come from understanding evangelism as partly an expression of the glory of God. And that people ought to be honoring him in their lives, and they're not.
That's right.
So I just feel like it's not only helped my motivation in evangelism, it's actually helped the way I share the gospel. And has occasionally put different language in my pocket, so to speak, for those moments as I'm just praying through those conversational moments, to just consider this may be the thing that I need to just persuade this person with.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think that is true, and we have seen it have some power in those moments. I think another way that it's changed things for us has been the way we pray when we pray for the lost. So I don't know if you've thought about it, but like, imagine like this was your prevailing worldview, that like, no, my first sympathies are with a God who made us for himself, and this person is spurning him, raising a high hand of rebellion and wanting to be on the throne themselves, and he deserves their worship. He deserves their praise. It's changed how I pray. Now, when I pray for, I'm thinking of a number of folks in my life that I pray for, that they would know the Lord. I'm praying something a lot more akin to like, Lord, please save him or her for your glory. Save them so that you would be glorified in their life. Would you put your kindness on display for my friend, so that another unworthy sinner would be able to praise the glory of your grace for all eternity? That's a different way to pray. But I found it's a powerful way to pray. Because I'm praying for the chief good, the chief value. It's not just, I don't want that person to go to hell. I don't want that person to go to hell. But more than anything, I want the Lord to be glorified in this image bearer's life. It reminds me again of a story that Paris Reed had told in his sermon where he was talking about the Moravian Christians. It was kind of a sect of Christianity back in the day who were known for being pioneer missionaries. And they would go out and they would like build their own caskets and bring it with them. Like they knew like I'm not,
intense.
I'm going to that island and I'm not coming back. And there were stories about them as they would sort of push off the coast and their friends and family are there watching them drift off to sea to go to this unknown land to bring the gospel with them. And what they would say back as they'd turn around is that they would shout back to the coastline, "May the lamb that was slain receive the reward of his suffering." And you go, that is beautiful and a different way to think about the work they're going to do, right? It's not just, I want this people group to know God. Yes, of course. Right. But do you see, it's the same side of it. I mean, it's a different side of the same coin, but it's a side of the coin we miss. May the lamb, imagine that, if that was the cry of our heart, in bringing the gospel to that coworker or that cousin or that neighbor, may the lamb that was slain receive the reward of his suffering. Jesus, you suffered and died to purchase for yourself a people for your own possession. That's what Titus 2 says. You purchased a people. And that guy or girl that I'm going to, that may be one of your people that you purchased before the foundation of the world. And I'm praying that reward would be yours, that you really that you would make them yours for your glory. Man, that has changed everything about the way I see reaching the lost world.
Right. And if I can say one more thing about that, I think for anyone listening who's like, gosh, that still feels kind of gross to me. But that's okay. That's where you're at, first of all. I understand that feeling of like, I don't know, right? We're talking about moving from a man-centered, mankind-centered way of viewing everything, God included, right? God exists to make our lives better, to God being at the center and mankind meant to serve him. Right? It's a big shift that we're talking about, and it's a very uncomfortable shift. But I would just share one thing that has really made a big difference for me and has changed this for me in a way that's felt extremely natural. And that has been a very thorough and consistent reading of the Bible. That might not be what you expect, but as I think about just the slow, I'm going to try and understand this book, read through it over many years. What I found happening was I was consistently shocked with the kindness of God toward people who hate him over and over and over again. I was like, you mean, like I just thinking of a few passages. Isaiah 30, where God tells them, to return to him that they might be saved and find strength, but you weren't willing. You weren't willing. You essentially ran away from me because you were like, no, thank you. I don't want to be with that God. But it says right after that, therefore the Lord longs to be gracious to you, and he waits on high to have compassion on you. It's like, what? You see it again in Hosea, at the end of the book of Hosea, where over and over and over again, the people of God are like adulterers to him, consistently and constantly going, I don't like you. I'd rather be with somebody else. And then he has right anger for that, and then says, how can I come in my anger? I have so much compassion within me. I am not like you. I will not come in wrath. He comes in Jesus to sacrifice himself. I mean, just like over and over again, all the way to the book of Revelation. At the end of all time, we get this future picture in the book of Revelation where God is consistently finding ways to preach the gospel to the rebels on earth. And it says they refuse to repent and would rather worship idols and demons. It's like, what? And you're still being nice to these people? I just think the consistent reading of the word for me, seeing the character and the nature of God from the scriptures and seeing the rebellion of mankind from the scriptures, and then seeing that in my own heart, my own culture, and my own life, created this increasing loyalty and even protection of God. Like, no, don't treat him that way. It's how I feel when there's a few times as a parent, I think I even shared this on the podcast, where my kids are mean to each other. And sometimes when it gets really bad, I will look at them and say, don't treat my son that way. Don't treat my daughter that way. There's a protectiveness with people you care about, even to the other person you care about. I care about all my children, but sometimes I need to remind one of them, hey, that's my son. It might be your brother. He's my son. You better be careful how you treat him. And I'll say that for all of them. And so the more I grow in affection toward the character of God, toward who he is, there's this increasing, don't treat him that way. Mm-hmm. Do you know how kind he is? You know, there's that just has grown in my heart and has made something that I think if I would have heard even this podcast episode in high school or even in some of my early college years, I would have been
You'd be like, how am I listening to myself?
That's right.
In
I would
the
first
future,
think that.
Then you would think the next thing you're about to say, which
exactly. It'd be super weird and Back to the Future-y. But I probably would have some resistance a little bit. I mean, by nature, I'm I'm driven largely by how can I help and serve others. That's a huge, just natural instinct in me. And so I think I would have had some resistance to some of what you're saying, but it's been growing in love for who God is that has awakened and made it very natural to talk like we talk right now, to think this way, to pray this way, and to share the gospel in the ways that we do, not just for the sake of people, but for the sake of the God I love. Mm-hmm. So if that's something you're feeling resistant to, that would be my challenge. It took me 7 years the first time I did it. Read through the Bible.
Yep.
So start now and talk to us in 7 years.
That's right.
We'd love to hear.
That's right. So let me end with just a challenge to you. Why don't you identify maybe one person in your life that you're eager to come know the Lord, that they're not walking with Jesus, not a Christian. You've maybe been praying for them. Maybe you've taken that step of faith to share the gospel with them. Why don't you say, here's your challenge. This week, would you sit down and put aside some time where you can pray for them with a God-centered prayer? And maybe you even write it out. I'm a journalist. Maybe you write out that prayer. But for you to pray with your first sympathies being with the Lord, and just plead for their salvation from that perspective. I would be so curious what that not only does to affect change, because we know prayer does things in the heart of God, and then he softens people's hearts and all that, but what it even does in your heart this week as you're thinking about that person, thinking about the Lord. We want to put these things into practice. So there's your challenge for this week, that you would find that one person that's far from the Lord, that you want them to come know Jesus, and that you would set aside some devoted time to pray for them this week, but that you would pray for them from a God-centered perspective. And then if you'd be so bold, and if God would provide the opportunity, that you would move toward them and be able to share the gospel, the news of the gospel with them, but to share it in such a way that it's flavored with this as well. Flavored with, there is a God who made you, who deserves your worship. And though you and I have spurned him, he has moved toward us in Jesus. He deserves our worship. We don't want it, and yet he's come for us. And he's died to purchase you. What an amazing thought that is. And I want you to know him. I want him to be enjoyed by you, because he's the most enjoyable being in the universe. These subtle changes, they color the way a person begins to understand from the very beginning of their thoughts about God. It begins to change the way they think about him. And I think it changes it in a way that's right and good. So there's the challenge for this week. I dare you. Triple dog. Done.
Thanks for joining us today, guys, for this episode. I hope that you'll take some time to check out our show notes on the website, because we have a lot of related resources on there, a lot of great additional content, things like that.
So great.
Look down in the show notes. There should be a link to our website to find a fuller version of that. Don't miss out on that. And make sure you subscribe to our email so that you can get those in your inbox. So subscribe to our email list, and then make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss these episodes.
Don't miss it. Wouldn't that be sad if you missed it?
Yeah.
I'm crying right now just thinking about it. I'm not crying. Just a little reminder to be identifying that person that's far from the Lord that you can be praying for in that God-centered way we talked about in this episode. And then even that God would give you the boldness, maybe even in this next week, to reach out to them and to be able to give them the hope of the gospel, but to do it even in a way that resonates with God being the great center of the universe that they get to enjoy forever if they would trust him. So much love to you guys, and we will see you next time.
For the last episode in the season.
Ooh.
Don't miss it.